Part 1. The trip wasn't my idea. I'm not the kind of guy who considers disconnecting to mean trekking miles into the wilderness where a bad Wi-Fi signal is the least of your problems. But Mike, my oldest friend, had been planning this camping trip for months, and after weeks of pestering, I caved. He said it would be fun, a spiritual retreat. We left on a Friday morning. Mike had picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from cell service, noise, and, as he put it, human nonsense. The trail was rugged, twisting through dense woods that swallowed up the sunlight. By the time we reached the clearing where we'd camp, the light had turned syrupy and golden. The clearing itself was small, encircled by towering pines that swayed slightly in the breeze, their silhouettes leaning in like curious spectators. A stream gurgled nearby, its sound oddly muffled, like the woods were keeping it to themselves. Mike was in his element, setting up tents and starting a fire while I mostly tried not to trip over roots. As night fell, the forest transformed. The cheerful chirping of birds was replaced by an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves that we ate in silence, the crackle of the fire our only company. Then came the first sound that was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a distant, hollow echo. It could have been the wind, but it wasn't. It had a rhythm, a cadence. Like someone whispering a song into the void. I laughed nervously, asking Mike if he heard it too. His face, normally plastered with an annoyingly confident smirk, was pale. "It's just the wind," he muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. But his eyes darted to the darkness beyond the flickering light. The whispers grew louder. And closer. The whispers didn't stop. They weren't constant either. It was as if something out there wanted us to listen, to notice, but not to understand. I couldn't pin down where the sound was coming from. Every time I thought I had it, the direction shifted, like the forest itself was playing tricks. Mike tried to shake it off. "Probably just an echo," he said, throwing another log on the fire. "Or water, maybe." But his tone betrayed him. His eyes kept flitting toward the tree line, scanning the shadows that crept closer as the fire burned lower. Around midnight, the whispers turned into something unmistakably human. A humming sound, soft, melodic, and deeply, deeply wrong. It wasn't a tune I recognized, but it had a pattern, a sinister, lullaby-like quality that set every hair on my body upright. "Mike," I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to be quiet. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, swallowing hard. "We should, maybe go check it out. Could be a lost hiker." Or, I countered, we could not. But Mike was already standing, his flashlight slicing through the dark. I didn't want to follow, but sitting alone by the fire wasn't an option either. With my pulse thundering in my ears, I grabbed my own flashlight and hurried after him. The woods were suffocatingly quiet now, save for that chilling hum. It drew us deeper into the trees, where the canopy above swallowed the moonlight. My flashlight seemed weaker here, like the darkness was too thick to be pierced. "Hello?" Mike called out, his voice cracking. The hum stopped, silence fell, heavy and smothering. I wanted to run back to the fire, to pretend none of this was happening, but before I could say anything, there was movement ahead. Just a flicker, a shadow slipping between the trees. Mike swung his flashlight wildly. "Hey!" he shouted, more forcefully now. "Who's there?" The shadow stopped. It stood just beyond the light's reach, still and waiting. I couldn't make out any features, just the vague shape of a person. And then it hummed again, not from the shadow. From behind us that we spun around, the beams of our flashlights trembling. Another figure now stood between us and the campfire. This one was clearer, its body unnaturally thin, its limbs long and angular. Its head tilted slightly, as if observing us with cruel curiosity. It hummed louder, and the sound seemed to vibrate in my skull, pulling my focus away from everything else. "Run," I heard Mike whisper. We bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, our flashlights whipping wildly as we tried to navigate the maze of trees. The humming swelled, impossibly loud, as though the sound wasn't coming from outside but inside our heads. My chest burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare stop. Mike was ahead of me, his light bouncing erratically in the darkness. "The fire," he shouted over his shoulder. "We need to get back to the fire." But when we stumbled into the clearing, it was gone, not just the fire, but the campsite itself. The tents, the gear, even the ring of stones we'd painstakingly built, all of it had vanished. In its place was a gnarled tree, its twisted branches reaching upward like skeletal hands. "What the?" Mike's voice broke as he stumbled to a halt. His flashlight beam landed on the tree's base. Carved into the bark was a symbol, a circle with a jagged, interlocking pattern at its center. The grooves glistened, as if freshly etched, and something about it made my stomach churn. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. "Mike," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What is this?" He didn't answer. When I turned to look at him, his flashlight had fallen to the ground, the beam now slicing through the mist that had crept into the clearing. Mike stood frozen, his eyes wide and glassy. His lips trembled, as if trying to form words, but no sound came out. Then I saw them. They emerged from the trees, their bodies long and impossibly thin, their faces obscured by shadows that seemed to cling to them like a second skin. There were at least 5 of them, and they moved with an unnatural, jerky grace. The humming started again, harmonizing now, layers of discordant notes weaving together into something that felt ancient and malevolent. My knees buckled under the weight of it, and I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just in the air, it was in me. Mike took a shuddering step forward, his arms limp at his sides. "No," I croaked, reaching for him, but my voice was drowned out by the growing cacophony. The figures surrounded him, their limbs elongating, curling like vines as they reached for him. Mike didn't resist. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, staring blankly as they pulled him into the shadows. That I don't remember running. I don't remember screaming. All I know is that I woke up hours later, sprawled on the forest floor, the sun bleeding orange through the trees. That I found my way back to the trailhead, my legs shaking with every step. When I reached the parking lot, Mike's car was still there, but he wasn't. It's been months now, and the nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear that melody, the humming, and I swear I see shadows moving at the edge of my vision. That I told the park rangers what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said the area we'd camped in was untouched wilderness, no trails, no campsites. But I know what I saw, and every so often, I think I hear Mike's voice. In the hum. Part 2. The idea came to me when my boss asked me to burn my vacation days before the end of the year. A solo camping trip, just me, my camera, and the quiet of the forest. I'd been craving isolation, some time to clear my head after months of grinding at work. The idea of no emails, no meetings, and no city noise sounded like bliss. That I chose a state park about 3 hours from home. The park had miles of winding trails and deep woods, with designated campsites that were spread far apart. Perfect. When I arrived, the ranger handed me a map and circled a few sites, but I asked for the most remote one. He hesitated before pointing to a spot near the edge of the forest, far from the main trails. "It's peaceful out there," he said, the corners of his mouth tightening. "But people don't usually choose that site." I laughed, assuming he thought I wasn't experienced enough. "I'll be fine," I assured him, slinging my pack over my shoulder. The hike to the site was uneventful, the air crisp and clean as the late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy. I reached the spot just as the shadows were beginning to stretch long and thin across the forest floor. The campsite was small but idyllic, bordered by towering pines and a sheer drop into a rocky ravine on one side. The nearest trail was at least a mile away. As I set up my tent and started a small fire, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. This was exactly what I needed. Then I found it, about 20 feet from my tent, just beyond the firelight's reach. I stumbled upon something carved into the dirt. A circle, roughly 4 feet across, with strange symbols etched along its edge. They weren't letters, more like crude drawings of animals and shapes I didn't recognize. At the center of the circle was a smaller symbol, 2 pine trees intertwined, their branches reaching toward each other. I knelt down, brushing away some of the loose dirt to get a better look. The carving seemed fresh, the lines sharp and clean. A prank, I thought. Maybe kids from a nearby town messing with campers. But as I stood, I felt a strange unease settle over me, like I was being watched. I shook it off, returned to the fire, and made myself dinner. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and the rhythmic chirp of crickets helped drown out my growing paranoia. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, I'd nearly forgotten about the circle until the first whisper. It started faint, barely audible over the crackle of the dying fire. A single voice, hushed and urgent, speaking words I couldn't understand. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. Another voice joined in. Then another. They came from all around me, soft and melodic, as if the forest itself was speaking. I fumbled for my flashlight, shining it into the trees, but the beam seemed swallowed by the darkness. The voices grew louder, overlapping, harmonizing in a haunting, otherworldly chorus, and then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind that makes your ears ring. I sat frozen, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, too scared to move. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the firelight, 2 tall pine trees stood side by side, their branches intertwined. And at their base, the circle had reappeared, this time glowing faintly, as if lit from within. The glowing circle pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. It bathed the forest in an eerie green light, illuminating the pines that swayed gently in the night air. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, unable to move, unable to think. The symbols around the edge of the circle seemed to ripple, like ink bleeding through paper. I whispered to myself, "This can't be real." The forest disagreed. The whispers began again, but this time they were different, closer, more insistent. They didn't just come from the trees, they came from the air itself, curling around me like smoke. The words were unintelligible, yet they felt deliberate, like they were meant for me. I stumbled to my feet, grabbing a burning stick from the fire. My flashlight had already failed me, the beam flickering weakly against the encroaching dark. With the firebrand in hand, I approached the circle. My legs felt heavy, as though the ground beneath me were trying to hold me back. When I was just a few steps away, I stopped. The air felt wrong. Thick. Oppressive. And the whispers, God, the whispers, were louder now, layered upon each other until they formed a suffocating cacophony, and then I saw them, figures, barely visible, standing between the trees. Their forms shimmered faintly, as though they were made of the same green light that pulsed from the circle. There were 5 of them, tall and impossibly thin, their elongated limbs blending into the shadows. They didn't move, but I could feel their attention, like needles pricking my skin. Who's there? I managed to croak, my voice weak and trembling. They didn't answer. But the whispers stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. It was heavy, pressing down on me, filling my ears with a dull roar. And then, as if on cue, one of the figures stepped forward. Its movement was unnatural, jerky, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. As it crossed the edge of the circle, its form solidified. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, its eyes hollow voids that seemed to absorb the light around them. It tilted its head, regarding me with something like curiosity. The firebrand in my hand hissed and sputtered, as though the heat itself was being drained away. I took a step back, and the figure mimicked me, its head twitching to the side as though studying my every movement. That I felt my back press against the trunk of a tree, the bark rough against my skin. The figure stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating off it like a winter wind, and then it spoke. Leave. The word was not a sound. It was a sensation, a pressure that reverberated inside my skull. My knees buckled, and I sank to the ground, clutching my head. The light from the circle pulsed faster now, the glow casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. That I managed to raise my eyes, just in time to see the figure's hand, long, spindly fingers tipped with sharp, black nails, reaching toward me. The figure's hand loomed closer, its skeletal fingers twitching slightly as they reached for me. I couldn't move. My body felt rooted to the ground, as though the forest itself had claimed me. My mind screamed to run, to fight, to do anything, but my limbs refused to obey. The whispers returned, louder now, a guttural symphony rising in unison. The light from the circle flared, illuminating the entire clearing in a sickly green glow. The other figures began to move, their jerky motions in sync, stepping closer to the circle. Their hollow eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking. Leave. The word echoed in my skull again, stronger this time. My head throbbed as the pressure built, but I couldn't look away from the figure before me. Its face, if you could call it that, began to twist and distort, the pale skin stretching unnaturally as it leaned closer. That I thought I was about to die. Then, something inside me snapped. The survival instinct that had been buried beneath my terror finally clawed its way to the surface. With every ounce of strength I had, I swung the smoldering firebrand in my hand. The burning wood struck the figure's arm, and a searing hiss filled the air as the ember met its flesh. The figure recoiled, an ear-piercing screech ripping through the forest. The sound wasn't human, it was something primal, something ancient. The other figures stopped in their tracks, their heads snapping toward me in perfect unison. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling backward as the figure writhed in pain. The whispers had turned into a deafening roar, the symbols in the circle now burning with an intense green fire. The intertwined pines at the center seemed to tremble, their branches creaking as though something inside them was trying to escape. That I turned and ran. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my skin as I hurtled through the forest, the roaring whispers chasing me like a living thing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only focus was on the faint outline of the trail ahead, illuminated by the pale light of the rising moon. When I finally burst onto the dirt path leading to my car, I collapsed, gasping for air. My body shook with adrenaline, and my ears rang with the echoes of the whispers. For a moment, I thought I was safe, then I saw it at I in the distance, just beyond the tree line. The green glow flickered once more. The figures stood at the edge of the forest, watching. Waiting. One of them raised its hand, its spindly fingers curling into a gesture that felt almost like a wave. I didn't stay to see what it meant. I don't remember much of the drive home. All I know is that I left everything behind, my tent, my gear, even my phone. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. Weeks later, I tried to report the strange symbols to the park rangers, but they dismissed it as a prank. When I described the figures, they exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. That I haven't gone camping since. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear faint whispers outside my window, just barely audible over the wind. And every so often, I'll dream of the pines, those twisted, intertwined trees, their branches reaching, always reaching, and I wonder if they're still waiting. Part 3. The cabin was supposed to be a birthday gift. My girlfriend Emily had planned the whole weekend, hoping to give me a break from the chaos of city life. She found it on some obscure rental site, a rustic gem deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. The photos looked charming, a weathered wooden cabin surrounded by towering evergreens, with a wraparound porch and a stone fire pit. It looked perfect. We drove out on a crisp October afternoon, the kind where the leaves painted the ground in fiery reds and oranges. The further we got from civilization, the quieter it became. The hum of traffic was replaced by the rustle of wind through the trees, and I could feel the stress melting off me. Emily glanced at me from the driver's seat and smiled. Told you you'd love it. When we finally reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. It looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. A trail led from the cabin down to a glistening lake, its surface shimmering in the fading light. Inside, the cabin was cozy but sparse. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and the few electrical outlets were old and unreliable. A brick fireplace dominated the living room, and the kitchen was stocked with just the essentials. Emily lit a few candles while I unpacked, and soon the cabin was bathed in a warm, flickering glow. As night fell, we built a fire outside and roasted marshmallows, the smoke curling into the star-studded sky. Emily laughed as I burned mine, and we shared stories until our voices felt as though they were the only ones in the world. It was perfect. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Emily and I froze, staring at each other. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Probably just a branch falling," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. But then it came again, a deliberate, rhythmic knock. It was coming from the cabin door. "Who could that be?" Emily asked, her eyes wide. We hadn't seen another car for miles on the way in. There were no neighboring cabins, no campsites, nothing but forest in every direction. I grabbed the flashlight from the fire pit and walked cautiously to the door, Emily close behind me. I opened it slowly, half expecting to see a lost hiker or a local hunter. But there was no one there. The porch was empty, the clearing beyond silent and still. Then I saw it, a small object sitting on the porch, just out of reach of the firelight. I stepped closer and crouched down, shining my flashlight on it. It was a wooden carving, crudely shaped like a man. Its face was blank, and its arms were twisted upward as if in prayer. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my stomach twisting. That's when we heard it, a distant laugh, soft and low, coming from the woods. The laughter lingered in the air, faint yet unmistakable. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, a low, guttural sound that sent chills racing down my spine. Emily clung to my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Is someone out there?" she whispered. Her voice cracked, the panic bubbling just beneath the surface. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, but the beams seemed to dissolve into the darkness, swallowed whole by the dense forest. "Probably just some kids messing around," I said, though even I didn't believe it. "Let's go inside." We shut the door, bolted it, and dragged the couch in front of it for good measure. The tiny wooden man sat on the coffee table where I placed it, its featureless face catching the flickering glow of the candles. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't help myself. "Do you think someone left it as a joke?" Emily asked, pacing the room. "Maybe." I forced a shrug. "But who would even know we're here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her attention to the windows, checking and rechecking the locks, pulling the curtains tight against the night. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, the only sound in the cabin. For a while, we sat in silence, listening for anything unusual. But as the minutes dragged on, nothing happened. The forest outside was as still as death, the earlier laughter seemingly a trick of our imagination. "Let's just go to bed," Emily said finally, her voice soft but strained. "It's been a long day." We turned out the lights, and I slid the wooden man into a drawer in the kitchen. Out of sight, out of mind. At least, that's what I told myself. The bedroom was small, with a single window that faced the woods. Emily lay curled up beside me, her breathing uneven as she fought to fall asleep. I stared at the ceiling, every creak of the old cabin setting my nerves on edge. Then, just as my eyelids began to grow heavy, I heard it. A knock. Not on the door this time. On the window. I shot upright, my heart pounding in my chest. Emily stirred beside me, muttering groggily, "What's wrong?" Another knock. Slow and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the window, my legs trembling with every step. The curtains were drawn, the fabric fluttering slightly in the draft. I reached out, hesitating for just a moment before pulling them aside. For a second, I thought I was imagining things. But then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bent at strange angles. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in shadow, but its head tilted slightly, as though it were watching me. And it wasn't alone. Behind it, barely visible among the trees, were more figures. Dozens of them. They stood in absolute stillness, their forms blending with the shadows of the forest. "Emily," I croaked, backing away from the window. "We're not alone." Emily bolted upright at my words, scrambling out of bed. "What do you mean? Who's out there?" "They're watching us," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I kept the flashlight trained on the window, though the beam only served to highlight the empty clearing just beyond. The figures were still there, standing motionless at the forest's edge, their forms just out of reach of the light. Emily moved to the window, her breath catching when she saw them. "Oh my God! What do they want?" "I don't know." My mind raced, searching for some explanation, any explanation, but none came. I pulled the curtains shut, the flimsy fabric doing little to block the oppressive presence outside. Then we heard it, the laughter again, soft at first, but rising in pitch and volume until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't human, there was no warmth or humor in it, only malice. It grew louder and louder, drowning out the crackle of the fire, the creak of the cabin, even the sound of our breathing. And then, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy void that seemed to suck the air from the room. Emily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What do we do?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. Before I could respond, the knock came again. But this time, it wasn't on the window. It was on the door. Slow. Rhythmic. Like a heartbeat. I grabbed the flashlight and the fire poker, my hands shaking as I crept toward the door. Emily followed close behind, clutching a kitchen knife. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer. The knocking continued, each one heavier than the last, until the door rattled in its frame. I could see the doorknob twisting, shaking violently, as though something on the other side was trying to force its way in. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the doorknob was still, and the knocking didn't resume. That's when I smelled it. Smoke. I spun around to see thick, black plumes pouring out of the fireplace, curling toward the ceiling. The fire had gone out, but the embers glowed brighter and brighter, their light casting jagged, flickering shadows across the walls. The whispers returned, soft and melodic, weaving through the cabin like a living thing. I could feel them brushing against my skin, pulling at my thoughts, my will. Emily clutched her head, sinking to her knees as she let out a strangled cry. I turned back to the door, desperate to escape, but the moment I touched the knob, I froze. The wooden man was back. It sat on the floor in front of the door, its blank face staring up at me. But now, its arms were no longer raised in prayer. They were extended outward, palms up, as though offering something. Something I couldn't see. "Don't touch it," Emily gasped, her voice trembling with terror. "Please, don't touch it." The cabin groaned, the walls seeming to bow inward as the whispers grew louder. The figures outside pressed closer, their faces, or the shadows where their faces should have been, peering through the windows. The laughter started again, a deafening roar that shook the very foundation of the cabin. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fight it. So I ran. I grabbed Emily by the arm and yanked her toward the back door. It burst open with a crash, and we stumbled into the cold night air, the forest alive with the sound of rustling leaves and cracking branches. The figures didn't follow. They stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us as we sprinted toward the car, their heads tilting in eerie unison. I didn't look back as I started the engine and tore down the dirt road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust. We never returned to that cabin. I contacted the rental site, but the listing had disappeared. When I tried to find it again on the map, the road wasn't there anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up to the sound of faint laughter in the distance. And sometimes, I'll see it, the wooden man, sitting on my windowsill, its arms stretched outward, waiting.